Hello, everybody. This is your facilitator, Debbie. Welcome to the Charities File webinar. What is the Charities File Fundraising Learning by Example? First of all, I want to say that I am not an employee of Revenue Canada. I myself am an executive director of a charity, and I worked in the charitable sector for about 20 years as an executive director, and prior to that as a fundraiser. So this project was started by Carleton University's Centre for Voluntary Research Development and the Community Sector Council of Newfoundland and Labrador. This seminar we're going through today is the newest module in a set of training and resources to help charities comply with CRA's rules and guidelines. As I mentioned on the charitiesfile.ca workshop, there are 3 other modules that you might find useful to go through on your own or to download, and also there are webinars and sometimes some live seminars, although those are wrapping up for this year, but we'll perhaps be starting again next year in a community near you, where you can find out more information on completing the T3010 and how to best manage your organization. And for those of you who are on boards of directors or treasurers, the Treasurer's Chest has a lot of great information that's specific to people taking a particular governance role in financial matters for their organization. So I'm going to try to give you the best advice I have when I'm answering your questions, but I can't give official answers. All of this material has been vetted by Revenue Canada for the project, and its goal of the project is to help charities sort of from the ground level up in a grassroots way to stay in compliance with the rules for managing your charity. And in the last year, there have been some changes to fundraising rules and regulations. So this is not a how-to on fundraising. So for those of you who've logged in hoping that I'm going to teach you how to raise $100,000 by the end of April to make up for any government or fundraising shortages you've had this year, you should log off now because I can't do that for you. However, what it will do is provide some guidance that will help you with your fundraising, and particularly on reporting your fundraising revenue and making decisions about your best practices for fundraising. So in this seminar, we'll talk about distinguishing what's a fundraising expense and what's another type of expense, how to allocate your fundraising expenditures on the T3010. And the T3010, for those of you who are quite new to charitable work, is the form you fill in at the within 6 months of your organization's fiscal year. You're required to send in the T3010. So just as all of us are probably preparing our T3, T4s and to send in for our personal taxes, this is to report on your revenues and expenses for Revenue Canada. And as I said, there's a whole module on how to complete it and the various forms that go with it. We're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with activities that have more than one purpose, i.e. that might be fundraising and also outreach or marketing, and how you might want to split some of your expenses for those. We're going to talk a little bit about how the Canada Revenue Association assesses what is an acceptable and an unacceptable fundraising practice. And particularly, we'll focus a little on what you don't want to be doing that isn't considered sort of okay by them. And we're going to identify what those activities are that may result in worst-case scenario sanctions, penalties, or revocation of your charity license. I'm sure that's not true for any of you, and that you all are in compliance and will remain in compliance. However, there are some things that people may not know they're doing that may result in a sanction or a warning. Again, we're going to go over a little bit of general information related to receipting, and in having taught some of these seminars live, I know people often have a lot of questions about receipting, particularly of things that are donated for auctions or other fundraising events, or how to treat in-kind donations. So if you can save some of your questions specifically about receipting till the last slide, then we can try to talk a little bit about some of those situations and what might work for you. So the implications of having charitable status. I don't know if all of you on the webinar today already are working for organizations that have charitable status, or some of you are deciding whether or not to get it, or are in the process of getting it. Again, on the charitiesfile.ca site, for those of you who might be applying for charitable status, there's a really great little hot button on how to apply for charitable status. For those of you who already have charitable status, you know that there are three key privileges for charitable status. There's the exemption from paying income tax on revenue that comes into your organization. Second key thing is an ability to issue official tax receipts for money that you've taken in or gifts that you've gotten, thereby reducing, for someone like myself who might give your charity a $100 donation, the income tax I would pay on that fund. For corporate donors, you can also give them tax receipts, although often it's more useful for them to use it as a marketing expense and for you to receipt their donation, but not actually issue them a taxable receipt. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on some of the slides coming up. One of the third privileges, and this is a key one people sometimes don't think of, is that you are able to receive funding from other registered charities because your organization, once you're registered for charitable status, is officially recognized as a qualified donee. So that means that if you can qualify for money from the United Way or from charitable foundations, like I'm in British Columbia, so here we have like the Vancouver Foundation who give out money to registered qualified donees here. The various Lions Clubs and Rotary Clubs and Variety Club all give money out and need to give it to qualified donees. So, of course, with privileges come responsibilities. So the responsibilities connected to maintaining your charitable status are, first of all, to demonstrate that you're devoting a substantial part of the money coming into your organization for the charitable purposes that you were registered for. So when you got your charitable statuses, let's say you're a food bank, and you say, our charitable purpose is to give food to the hungry. So you want to be using about 80%, it's a general rule of thumb, of your resources to the charitable purposes, i.e. giving out food to the hungry, that you're registered to do. The second key thing is that you need to file the T3010B information return. Again, as I mentioned a little while earlier, this is not completed on the fiscal year, i.e. January through December. You complete it within 6 months of whatever your fiscal year is. A lot of organizations that are government funded might have their fiscal year end at the end of March, meaning that your T3010B has to be then turned in at the end of September. And then the third is just to carry out other obligations that you have agreed to under the Income Tax Act, and make sure you stay in compliance with those. This seminar is called Best Practices, and that's because the Canada Revenue Agency is provided a list of what they consider to be best practices, not rules, but just the best practices to run your organization and help you decrease the risk of any unacceptable fundraising that you may be tempted to do, because in this day and time we all want to have as much money coming into our organizations as we can in a very competitive fundraising environment, and also a very challenging economic time for organizations, particularly those who have had a lot of government support, which may be being cut back. So the key things you want to focus on are prudent planning processes, appropriate procurement processes, good staffing processes, ongoing management and supervision of your fundraising practices, or setting up good management and supervision if you're just starting out in fundraising, some adequate evaluation processes for all the activities your organization is doing, both your program activities, but as well your staff and your fundraising practices, to make sure you're using volunteer time and volunteer resources and services as much as possible, and also documenting what that volunteer time and volunteer services are so that you can show how you're saving money by using volunteers. And the seventh best practice is to disclose your fundraising costs, revenue, and practice. So those are the key areas that we're going to go through in a little bit more detail in all of the slides. I'm just going to go through to the next slide. Prudent planning processes. So just like in life, it's always good to plan before you embark on activities. And particularly with your fundraising, you want to do some prudent planning. So let's say you're planning an event. Your planning costs should be reasonable and proportionate to the size and scope of the activity. Referring to CRA's guidance on fundraising, So you want to make sure that whatever the event, let's call it an event or a planned giving campaign or direct mail or a capital campaign, all the various types of fundraising you might be exploring. You want to ensure that you've read the CRA's guidance on fundraising. And actually the CRA website is just great generally, along with the Charities File website, the CRA, which is cra.gov.bc.ca. And there is a slide, you don't need to write these down, there's a slide at the end of the presentation that gives you a lot of websites. But they have a whole great annotated guidance on fundraising. Or not annotated, but guidance on fundraising and what is permissible and what's not, and examples of receipts and all manner of things and answers to commonly asked questions that you can look up on their website. So you also want to research the costs of whatever the fundraising activity you're doing versus the potential revenue. There's a ratio which Revenue Canada likes people to look at following in their fundraising, which we'll talk about in a couple slides down the road. So you want to make sure that the costs and the potential revenue are balanced out in a reasonable percentage, i.e. that you're not spending 90 cents to make 10 cents. You also want to explore various fundraising methods and consider, what trends and things are happening in fundraising and what's worked well for other people or what's worked well for you in the past. How is the slide movement with the little time delay? Is that working well for everybody? Maybe you can just send RuPaul a little note and let her know if the speed at which we're going through the slides works for you and if you're able to see them all okay on your slides. So preparing for fundraising activities. I mentioned that you want to review the CRA's guidance on fundraising, but in particularly you want to review Section 7, which is prohibited conduct, because you certainly don't want to do anything that could lead to further review. We have this great little chart here that a guy named Tom, who works at Carleton, made, which is a really great guide, not just today, but for you to print out and keep for whenever you're making decisions or preparing for fundraising activities. So as you'll see, it's a beautiful little flow chart. So you want to review and make sure you're not doing anything prohibited. You want to ensure that the scope of the fundraising you're doing is appropriate to the time and resources allocated to it. So not only money, you don't want to spend 10 cents to make 90 cents, but you also don't want to spend 45 hours working in an event to raise $20. You want to develop practices and tools to track and record your expenses, your methods, and your revenues related to the activity. These will help you in all your fundraising you're doing, but it will also help you at year end when you're completing your T3010 or evaluating your fundraising events or activities to review how much each one cost you when you're deciding whether you'll do it again next year. So developing just something simple like an Excel spreadsheet or whatever systems you already have set up for accounting for your expenses and revenue, just replicate them and put your fundraising expenses into it. So going along the flow chart, does the activity include charitable gaming? So each province has different rules about charitable gaming. So if you're doing a fundraising activity as part of your overall fundraising plan, that's a bingo or doing casino or just applying for a charitable gaming grant, then if you've answered yes to that question, then you want to make sure here in BC, it would be the BC Gaming Branch, and Ontario would be the Ontario Gaming Branch, and you want to contact them and make sure that you have all the reporting they require and that you're clear on what their percentages are of what can be used for administration or how much has to go specifically for the project you've been successful in receiving gaming revenue for. So if it's another kind of activity, not gaming, is it a fundraising method you used before? Like, is this your second year of doing a letter campaign at Christmas asking people for money? If the answer is yes, then you'd want to review the outcomes of last year and apply the lessons learned, i.e., wow, we sent out 3,000 of them and we got 1,000 return envelopes with their addresses no longer valid. So you would certainly want to make sure you weren't, that your mailing list had been updated and you weren't mailing to those people. Similarly, you might have had an event where you had an art auction and people might have said to you, oh my goodness, people didn't buy art at the auction. So you might decide, oh, we're going to try to auction something else off this year because it didn't go that way that year. So if it's not a fundraising method you've used previously, If it's a new idea that you or one of your board members have, then you might want to conduct some research to assess, to kind of do a risk analysis of what's the benefit, what will the cost be, do we want to give it a go, is this a particular method that's working well? Investigate other fundraising methods to determine what's going to bring you the most money with the lowest cost, both in expenses and manpower. I think that's always the goal of everyone, is to do, the best kind of fundraising and outreach you can with the least manpower and the least amount of expenses. You want to maintain a clear and concise record of all the results from consultations and research. You may or may not want to hire a fundraising consultant. You may just be doing the research and consulting yourself. If you're embarking on something major like a $10 million capital campaign, you're probably going to want to try to get some external help from outside your organization, and perhaps a consultant to help you determine whether or not it's a realistic plan in your community and with your connections and with your government funders to pursue such a large kind of endeavor. You then want to establish, once you've determined you're going to do the activity, you want to establish a budget for it, include the goal and what you estimate the expenses will do, and then once it's done, calculate the ratio. If the result is that you've raised 35%, that you've raised 65 cents and you've spent 35 cents for every 65 cents you've raised, that's probably good. If you've spent 65 cents and raised 35 cents, then you're going to want to look at ways to reduce the cost if possible as you carry on through future years with the activity. So carrying on, then the second thing you want to do when you've reviewed all of that is, and you've decided to go forward with the activity, is that you want to use appropriate procurement processes. So procurement means getting things. So you want to solicit bids for goods and services from at least 3 suppliers, issue a request for proposal. Now that doesn't have to be a big formal request for proposal like if you're just getting catering or something for an event that you're going to hold, or if you are doing a mail out and you want to do a brochure. Your request for a proposal can be an email to 3 possible providers to get quotes on how much it's going to cost you to have the brochure printed or the food for your event or whatever it is you're purchasing. You also want to ensure that anyone that you're buying anything from or purchasing contracted work from, any supplier, that you have an arm's length relationship with them. So an arm's length relationship, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, means that whoever you're purchasing from does not have, is not going to be gaining benefit from your charity, other than if you're hiring the fundraising plaque maker down the street, obviously the benefit's going to be that he makes money off selling you the fundraising plaques. However, you wouldn't want to do that or have him be the only quote or the only service provider if he was married to the executive director or the fundraiser of your organization, or if the fundraising plaque maker was on your board of directors. So then that supplier does not have an independent relationship from your organization. They, in fact, are not at arm's length. Arm's length can be basically husband, wife, partner, somebody who's a user of your service. If you do need to procure somebody from someone who's not at arm's length, you certainly then at least want to document it well. And let's use example of catering. Let's say the board president's wife of your organization had a catering company, and you solicited 3 bids and services from caterers for a party that you were having for a fundraising party of some sort. You'd certainly then, if you wanted to use the board member's wife's catering company because she had the lowest bid because she's supportive of your charity, then you would want to document well that you had gotten the 3 quotes, that she wasn't particularly benefiting, and in fact she was giving up some of her normal catering costs to provide this as a gift to your organization because of her loyalty to it. Basically, the same reason you can't have a lot of arm's length, you want to have at least 50% of your board of directors, if possible, at arm's length from one another in the organization, is that in the charitable sector we are funded by the donations and other people, and we need to be transparent in all our activities, and no one should be getting unnecessary personal benefit other than the love in their heart of doing good work or belief in what your organization's doing, but they shouldn't be lining their pockets with selling things to your organization. So purchasing goods and services. Again, we have another one of these handy-dandy charts here. So we'll just go through it briefly. So goods and services include external third-party fundraisers, gifts, premiums for donors, and facilities and equipment rentals. You want to apply the same results from the preparation stage of the fundraising activity, which is issue a request for proposals, do some research, get at least 3 quotes. Where possible, you want to develop practices to utilize your own resources for services, i.e., if the activity can be carried out as effectively and efficiently as contracted services, i.e., do you have volunteers who can do some of the work? Can you do some of the copying in-house? And if the answer to that is no, we have to hire out, then you again want to get 3 quotes where possible. If there's a situation where, let's say for some bizarre reason, you order something unusual that only has one supplier, like a stuffed armadillo to recognize your donors or something, then there may only be one supplier in Texas. And so in that case, you would want to document. You want to document anyway. You want to document who the 3 quotations were that you've asked for. But if or you live in a small town and there is only one fundraising recognition plaque maker, you want to carefully also document why you didn't get 3 quotes if for any reason you did not. So once if you said yes, 3 quotes are received, then you want to ask the next question, is the supplier at arm's length? So if the question is yes, they're at arm's length, you might want to add a provision to contracts for, say, fundraising services, ensuring that whoever you've hired to do some fundraising for you will also comply with the fundraising guidance that Revenue Canada has put forward, and that they understand the rules of that. And also that contracts with third-party fundraisers should be based on time and effort as opposed to the number or dollar amount of donations. I'll just speak to that a little bit, and then if people have any questions about a third-party fundraiser or hiring somebody on contract to do your fundraising, the key things are that you want to make sure that the third-party fundraiser, let's say the bar down the street is having a band on Friday night, and for every $10 admission somebody gives, they're going to give your charity $2 of it. So you just want to make sure that you actually get the money, that you have some kind of little letter or note of agreement that they're representing you properly, and that they're also raising money properly on your behalf, and that the time and effort you're putting into it is also going to be worth the dollar amount of the donations. For any contracts you have with fundraising services, you want to make sure that the fundraiser doing them is following the guidance. You also want to make sure that you're not hiring a fundraiser on a percentage basis to raise funds for your charity. So that would be like if I came to you and said, hey, I've been fundraising for 20 years. Please hire me. I will raise $1 million for you, and I want to be paid 10% of that, which is $100,000. Now, that may or may not be a good, fair rate to hire me at, but chances are it's not. And Revenue Canada now really frowns on percentage-based fundraisers being utilized, and also the Association of Fundraising Professionals, you can't belong to it and do percentage-based fundraising. So often this brings up some questions for people, so we can talk a little bit about that more at the end if people have questions about that or want to know why. But for now, I'm just going to keep going through this little template. So let's say, and you also always want to have provisions in any little letters of agreement or whatever. These don't have to be legal contracts if it is like the bar down the street raising money for you on a Friday night by having a band tonight or something. But you want to be, like if they're going to do it every Friday night and it's not working out, or it's resulting in bad press for your organization or something, let's say that some rowdy fight erupted or you never got any money from them after they said they were going to give you money and used your name for people going and goodwill and thinking they were supporting you. You want to include provisions to terminate the contracts, either for third-party fundraisers or for anyone you might be hiring to do some contract fundraising work to. Just like with any employee, when you hire someone new, you often have a 3-month probation period. You would want to do the same in your fundraising agreements to make sure you can get out of what may be a not good situation for you. So you want to clearly document how you procured, negotiated, and came up with the contracts or the letter of agreement or whatever it is, and maintain a file so that if you leave the organization, someone else can find it when they start thinking of what to do for fundraising next year. You also want to review all the contracts annually, say, or something, and ensure the terms are reasonable and limit the length when signing initially, as mentioned before. So let's say the supplier is not at arm's length. We talked about why that is. Again, just document, document, document. So the third key area is to ensure you have really good staffing processes. Good people equal good results. And you want to ensure that the compensation paid to your fundraising staff is reasonable and does not exceed what is typically paid, whether you're hiring somebody on contract or you're hiring somebody as an ongoing staff. One website you might want to check for sort of what fundraising salaries are in your region and also for job descriptions is called Charity Village, www.charityvillage.ca or .com. And that's a great place to look at where a lot of charitable job postings and particularly fundraising job postings are put. You can also check with the Association of Fundraising Professionals. They also have a website, and that's a good way. And then you can also just ask around other charities in your communities, hey, Bob, what do you guys pay your fundraiser, and what do they do? And because fundraising salaries also vary quite a lot based on the scope of work. If you're raising millions of dollars and are the director of development for a university, your salary responsibilities and background, education and work experience are going to be quite different than if you're starting out just sort of doing some door-to-door canvassing for a more grassroots organization or for, with the goal of raising a lower amount of money annually. So you want to make some decisions around that. You want to make sure that your compensation obviously does not exceed fair market value, same as purchasing goods and supplies. If you're purchasing people and their skill sets, you want to make sure that you're doing so with, paying the most you can, but to make sure the person is well compensated within the means of your organization, but also not overly compensated. You can want to develop accountability practices for supervising and evaluating fundraising staff, just like all of the other staff you have, and establish annual performance evaluations and practices that are not solely based on the amount of money coming in. Ideally, you don't want to hire a fundraiser who never raises any money for you after years and years go by, but you also want to supervise, particularly when a fundraising program is starting out, like that there's groundwork to be done and that you're paying the person to do the work to prepare for the donations to come in later, because there could be a little bit of a time differential. Then you want to do ongoing management and supervision of your fundraising practices and staff, again, ensuring that you meet your regulatory obligations and that you are exercising adequate control over any fundraising efforts that you're making. So you want to establish a set of fundraising practices for the management and supervision of all the activities. And you want to make sure that they comply, we mentioned with gaming, with any municipal, provincial, or federal regulations. Each province has a little bit different regulations in Canada, so we don't have like one only. You certainly want to use the CRA's fundraising guidance, but you don't want to focus solely where there may be some different legislation in your province as well that you need to adhere to. You want to establish some practices to monitor your fundraising activities. Often I think charities can kind of get in the rut of like, oh, we're going to have a gala again because it's its 25th anniversary. In some cases, the gala may be taking all the organization's fundraising manpower, time, and effort and not raising that much money for you anymore. So you want to, again, evaluate both existing and new fundraising activities. You want to ensure your volunteer and staff are properly trained in following fundraising rules and agreements. You may have a really keen new volunteer who's going out fundraising for you, but, making promises that can't be kept, like, hey, Ralph, if you give us $10,000, I'll have a brass bust of you made for my charity's lobby, or, I will give you a tax receipt for that architectural work you've done for us, when, in fact, you can't give a tax receipt for gifts of services without going through a special procedure. You want to ensure that all fundraising staff and external endeavor to use volunteers whenever possible. Revenue Canada is really wanting to ensure that the volunteer sector and their contributions to support your charities are recognized. So much happens in the nonprofit sector with the help of volunteers that, like, if we were paying staff to do those activities, our expenses would be a lot higher. So they want to make sure that they see you are using volunteer services and resources practices whenever possible, and that, that's documented so we can keep good track of what the volunteer sector is doing for our charities and our societies and our social fabric. You also want to meet periodically with your volunteers and staff to obtain feedback and see what they think is working and not working, or what adjustments need to be made. If an external fundraiser is going to be contracted and you answer yes, you want to make sure you're following the proper procurement practices. So we talked about that earlier, the 3 quotes, etc. And you want to have a good contract in place to make sure that one understands what the person is being hired to do, what the expectations of performance are, and what the tasks to be accomplished are. And also, you need to make sure that your external fundraiser understands what the rules are, and again, won't offer someone a brass bus or a recognition that's inappropriate, or an offer of a receipt that's not appropriate or allowable. I'm just going to go through now to the adequate evaluation processes, which are basically you want to assess your fundraising performance and develop policies and procedures for those evaluation of your activities. So you want to ensure that the resources devoted to the fundraising activity are also proportionate to the scope of activity. I mean, you don't want to spend all your time evaluating, and never being actually out there fundraising and producing work and money for your organization and your programs. You want to evaluate the activity in relation to the conduct in Section 11 of the CRA policy. You want to establish practices to prevent that type of contact, as well as steps to be taken when it does occur. So that is any kind of misconduct you don't want to have happening, or prohibited contact. So that could be something like a political activity or political campaign. There are clear rules and guidelines about doing activities that are prohibited and how much you can do some political lobbying, but you can't do promotion of a candidate, for example. I imagine there aren't very many of you who are doing sending overseas militia sort of terrorist work. That would also be a prohibited activity. So you want to make sure you're not doing any activity that's a prohibited activity. You want to utilize the fundraising ratio on a periodic basis to assess whether expenses are excessive based on the donations. Again, there might be situations where you're trying a new activity and let's say you're doing a 50-50 draw and you spend 50 cents and you raise 50 cents. But generally, you want to try to spend, 0 to 30 cents to raise $1, and to a larger scale. You want to aim toward that over time. There may be situations where, for good reasons, i.e. you're starting your fundraising, or you're in a really small community, or you just have an event that bombs and you're not going to do it again, but where your ratios are different. But overall, of course, you want to try to get your fundraising ratios up where you're not spending too much money to bring in money. So that's why they have a fundraising ratio, which is basically how much did you spend, how much did you bring in, that's greater than 35%. If you spent more than 35%, they might ask you to assess the situation, say why you had to spend so much money to make some money, and reevaluate at a later date. I mentioned earlier, planned giving. So if you are doing something like, trying to encourage people to make bequests or gifts of life insurance to your organization, then you may want to, you're not going to make any money right away with the money you're spending either on staff or materials to bring in that money. So that's fine, but you just have to be able to say this is a portion of our overall fundraising. We're doing planned gift, and we hope to get huge benefits from it down the road, but at this point we're spending money on it and we're not really bringing anything in. So if the fundraising activity includes donor acquisition or planned giving, you just want to document the campaign and show that you were following all of the best practices and establish a timeline when you incur the expenses and when you're hoping the donations may be expected. So, if you've made a planned giving, you've spent some time cultivating somebody for a bequest who is 40 years old, you're going to hope that that bequest doesn't come in for, another 50 years or something. If you're, have someone who's agreed to provide you with a bequest that's in their 90s, you could reasonably expect that the gift could come in 10 years or something like that. So they just want you to sort of look into that. Now, if it's an activity that costs a great deal more, like let's say you spent 70 cents and only made 30, then you want to tabulate and consolidate the evaluation results and say, like, well, we did this as a first time kind of both outreach and, fundraising activity, people aren't very aware of our charity, then, but we're hoping that it will build every year and our percentages will increase. So you just need to document that as well. Like, I keep saying it over and over and over, but just documenting what you do will really help you, not only to answer to Revenue Canada, but to also make good decisions for planning for future years for yourself. The next slide, using your volunteer time and volunteer services. As we mentioned before, documenting these is great. And also using volunteers is great because it reduces the expenses of hiring someone to do the work. And you also are helping to ensure that you're meeting CRA guidelines, which is that, charities are using volunteer labor. So for those of you who may be union activists or whatever, or have union staff, you want to make sure your volunteers aren't being utilized, to take away union jobs or anything like that, but that are doing things within your organization which you would be paying other people to do, which still are needed and contributing. And everybody on your board of directors, for example, in a nonprofit organization has to be a volunteer because no one can be compensated for being on your board of directors. And also if it was a compensated person, then they would no longer be at arm's length. They would be benefiting from their role on your board. So it's quite different in the nonprofit sector than, say, on corporate boards, where people actually get paid salary sometimes to be on corporate boards. So use volunteer services and time wherever possible and demonstrate the charity is taking action to reduce expenditures. Also, as it becomes more and more competitive for grants and stuff, I think people are very interested in seeing what charities have a lot of support, both of membership and volunteers, so that they know that there's a lot of public support for your organization and they should give you a grant or support you. You'll find, I think, as time goes on, that it's going to become more important to document and be clear that you have a lot of volunteers and enthusiasm for your programs and services. So some of the questions people sometimes have is, what is the difference between a volunteer and a participant? So a participant is somebody who is seeking a donation based on their completion or participation in a fundraising activity. So let's say by some miracle I decide to climb Mount Kilimanjaro or something for charity. So I would be going around with a little pledge sheet asking all of my friends and loved ones and families to pledge anything, from $10 to $10,000 to support me to climb Mount Kilimanjaro for cancer or something. So at that point I'm a participant. I'm volunteering my time, but I also am seeking donations to complete and participate in something. Walk runs would be a classic example of this. Now, if I'm a volunteer, that I've joined the board of another organization, or I've just decided that every Saturday I'm going to go and help at the food bank, give out food every Saturday afternoon, then I'm a volunteer. I'm just an unpaid individual who's doing a task. Or I could also be a volunteer on a board seeking donations for fundraising for the charity. So that would be the difference between a volunteer and a participant. In either case, with a volunteer, you don't issue tax receipt for services or resources that are volunteered. Generally, you don't give tax receipts out for any donation of a gift of service. So if I was a lawyer giving you legal advice, you couldn't provide me with a receipt for that. There is a method which you can do that by, and we'll get to that in a few minutes and as well in the question period. So, step number 7, disclosing your fundraising costs, revenues, and practice. Again, in a very competitive era, both for government and for private funding and donations, disclosing and being very straight ahead with what money you're spending on fundraising and your revenues and your practices is very important. Donors are becoming very savvy, and they do look up things online. And by the way, all of you can look yourself up on the CRA website if you're a registered charity, because there'll be a little information blurb about your charity, as well as a review and overview of your T3010 expenses and income and who's on your board of directors from the past years, and also a little blurb about what your programs and services are. So donors, I think, are using the internet a lot more to compare and to contrast charities and to make sure that everybody wants their money to go to the cause and the programs and services that they said they would do that. So, and you're also required for the yearly reporting on the T3010 now to fill out specific line items regarding your fundraising costs, revenues, and practices. So you want to make sure that you're just being as open and transparent as you can. You can put little charts in your annual report. You can put online, we are only spending 15 cents on the dollar for our administration and fundraising costs, and the rest is all going to programs and services. You can disclose any way you just want to be accountable and accurate. A complete record on your T3010 is one way to do that. As well, some of you would either have audited or reviewed financial statements, and you'll want to break your fundraising costs and expenses out of those. And also you want to ensure how much you spent raising money and make sure that everybody knows that you're doing it in the proper and correct way. That you're not spending too much money to make money. This has all come about somewhat because there were organizations that were in the business of charity, like telemarketers in particular. I'm sure we've all had the calls at night asking us to send children to the circus or some such. But it was becoming a business for a while where people were hiring people just to call and make money, but they weren't giving the charity that much of the money they were utilizing. So that results in not great public, empathy and stuff for charity. So we want to make sure that you're disclosing and you're not doing that, and your revenues and practices are all honorable and following yours. So if it's your fiscal year end, you want to gather all the information to complete the T3010, and you want to give some time to that. There's nothing worse than having it due the next day and having to call up board members to get their names and birth dates and stuff to send in, or trying to find the file on how much a particular fundraising event raised the previous year. So just keep all your stuff in a timely fashion, and for things like for the amount of the tax receipts that you've given out, it's a really good idea to maybe do a little quarterly tally of them so you know what the receivable income is that you're going to be writing on your T3010, and also what your other fundraising revenue that you've generated that hasn't been receipted. You also need to report that, and that affects something called your disbursement quota. So you want to do as much as you can by that early in the year to, avoid last-minute struggles with your T3010. The other thing to ensure transparency is that your T3010 has to be signed by one of your directors or like official and to be sent in on time. The main reason charities lose or have their charitable status revoked or are given sanctions and penalties is because they either haven't filed their T3010 at all, or they're just repeatedly late, and I mean really late, like months and months and months late. It's not because there's very few. There was a charity about a month ago in Ontario who were sanctioned and penalized and closed down because they were raising money and they weren't giving any of it to programs and services. They weren't doing what they said they were doing, and they were forging bank records, etc. They are the very, very, very rare exception, like 1 or 2%. Most of the reason people are sanctioned are that they've done something wrong by mistake without knowing what it is, or they haven't sent in their T3010 or reported or sent their forms. There's a really handy annotated guidance on fundraising by registered charities. I'm not sure, I don't think these are hot links in the webinar, but if you go on to the charitiesfile.ca website, you can click on them. There's a great annotated guidance on fundraising by registered charities, which gives a lot more information. I've touched on some of them just briefly because this is a 1-hour seminar in this field. And now, if you can send us some questions, I'm going to start answering them. Okay, so the first question we have is, can you issue individual receipts for donations for a membership drive? Yes, you can, depending on whether or not there is a lot of benefit derived from being a member of your organization. So an example of when you could give a membership receipt is if you have a $20, like we'll just say $20, it could be any amount, membership for joining your organization, and all the person gets is the ability to vote at your AGM and perhaps some newsletters and things like that, and that is the only benefit they give, then you can issue them a tax receipt for their donation. If they receive something for their membership that gives them an advantage, like some money or percentage coming for them, for example, I belong to a bluegrass club here and my membership gets me 10% off at an instrument shop, then I am getting a financial advantage. So my membership is no longer considered a straight gift, so it doesn't qualify for a tax receipt. General rule of thumb for receipting is that it needs to be a gift with an intent to give a gift with no personal benefit back in order to be eligible for a tax receipt. I should also mention that there is a whole module on the charitiesfile.ca on receipting, which you might find useful. goes into specifics around what you need to have on your tax receipt, like the Revenue Canada website, and how you can do, it goes into a lot more detail about in-kind receiving gifts in kind and how you do that, and also split receiving when you have questions around that. Okay, so another question has just come in. If we offer a service free of charge and then the person gives a donation, can we give them a receipt, or is that an advantage? Well, I'm going to presume that you mean the person, like let's say you were offering a free haircut and the person gave a donation, can you give them a receipt? I would say that they've just had their haircut, so it's an advantage and not. So I'd have to know more about the specifics of that situation. Basically, anytime I'm getting something from you and then giving a donation, it shouldn't be receivable. However, let's say you have come join us for breakfast and learn all about our organization, and there's no charge to attend, and you've had coffee and a muffin, and then at the end, you know, you're moved by the presentation of the speakers, and you take home a donation slip, and you fill it out, and you send the charity $100, then yes, you could get a tax receipt. So it really depends on what the service you're offering is free of charge and what the person has received in exchange and kind of what the value of that is. Okay, another question. If you have a benefit value, can you issue a receipt for part of the donation? Yes, that's called a split receipt. So a classic example would be if you are, like, say, holding a golf tournament and you're charging $100 to go to the golf tournament and the person has their green fees and lunch included. Then you would do what's called a split receipt, which is you'd say, the green fees are $50, the lunch is worth $10, so they're giving me $100. I'm going to give them a tax receipt for $40 because that's the part that they're not receiving anything directly in exchange from, and the $60 would be the benefit that they're receiving. Another question that's come in. What does it mean when you state that organizations have to demonstrate that the charity is devoting a substantive portion of its resources to the charitable purposes it was registered for? Does this include operational expenditures, including rent and building maintenance? Yes, it does. You want to, unless your rent and your building maintenance are things that also you're running programs out of, at which point some of them can be considered a program expense. Basically, again, I'll just use the example of a food bank because it's easy. I don't run a food bank or anything. I think they're great, but I'm just using it as an easy example. If I'm running a food bank and I have a big warehouse that I store all the food in, and I have a bookkeeper, and I have an executive director, and I have a fundraiser, and I also have people giving out food and taking in food and invoicing it, and some volunteers, etc. Basically, the rule of thumb I'd want to be going for is that I would be wanting to use at least 80% of all the money that comes in to giving out the food, to doing my program. Or if I was running a women's shelter, I would want to be sheltering women and families and children and using 80% of any money I had toward that, and using the other 0 to 20% to run my organization, to pay my rent, to pay my bookkeeper, to do all those very real administrative costs that are related to a charity. But you basically want to kind of keep an 80-20 rule of thumb happening with that. Hope that answers your question. Okay, another question has come in. Would you consider thank you gifts such as flowers or chocolates for a volunteer who have worked on a fundraising event as a fundraising expense? I would either consider them a fundraising expense or a volunteer expense, depending on how I did my budget. I think that I would put it as volunteer recognition to thank the person for coming out. And it sounds like you're a great place to volunteer from if you're giving flowers and chocolates for volunteers who've worked as a fundraising event. You can put them as an expense or you can put them as a volunteer expense. It just depends on, how often the person volunteers. If they're only volunteering for you for that fundraising event, then you might want to put that expense as fundraising event A, volunteer recognition under it as a fundraising expense. And I'm presuming you're buying them, a bunch of tulips as opposed to, $1,000 worth of hydrangeas for their yard or something that they can then take and plant. You also want to keep your volunteer recognition, at a reasonable level, you want to recognize them and thank them with something nice like a $10 bouquet or some chocolates. Otherwise, if you're thanking them with a large gift, then you might as well have hired staff. That kind of goes without saying. I hope that answers your question. So again, thank you all very much, and I hope you'll take some other Charities File webinars or reference some of the other material in time. Have a good day, everybody.